The lecture hall buzzed with quiet conversation as students from 12 different species settled into their seats. Professor Zextera, a tall Velthari with silver-scaled skin and for arms, stood at the front of the massive amphitheater. Her upper hands gestured toward the holographic display, while her lower hands operated the control interface with practiced ease. Today we examine primitive weapons technology from across the galaxy, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic enhancement system. Each civilization developed unique solutions to the fundamental problem of warfare before discovering energy-based weapons. The hologram shimmered, displaying an array of ancient weapons floating in three-dimensional space. Students leaned forward, their various appendages poised over note-taking devices. The collection was impressive. Crystalline spike throwers from Altair 7, plasma forge blades from the Centauri colonies, and biometal whips that had once been wielded by the warrior priests of Zephyria. These weapons, Professor Zextera continued, represent the pinnacle of pre-industrial military technology. Each species channeled their natural abilities and environmental resources into creating tools of war that defined their early conflicts. A student near the back raised a tentacle. "Professor, what about the humans? I don't see any of their weapons in the display." Several students turned to look at the lone human in the class. Marcus Chun sat quietly in the middle section, his dark hair falling slightly over his eyes as he studied the holographic weapons with unusual intensity. He had been the only human to enroll in Professor Zextera's comparative military archaeology course this semester, and his presence had initially surprised many of his classmates. Professor Zextera's facial scales shifted color slightly, a sign of mild embarrassment among her species. An excellent observation, student Krillnox. Human weapons are indeed absent from today's primary display. This is because human warfare technology followed a rather unique evolutionary path. She manipulated her controls, and the current display faded. A new collection of weapons appeared, looking distinctly different from the elegant, specialized tools they had just observed. These weapons appeared crude, almost primitive by comparison. Rough metal surfaces, wooden components, and what appeared to be leather wrapping characterized most of the items. Human weapons development was constrained by their planet's limited resources and their species' physical limitations, the professor explained. Humans possess no natural armor, limited physical strength compared to most sapient species, and no specialized appendages for combat. Their early weapons reflect these constraints. The display rotated slowly, showing swords with simple steel blades, wooden bows with metal-tipped arrows, and spears with basic stone or metal points. A few students chuckled quietly at the apparent primitiveness of the human arsenal. Marcus remained silent, but his grip tightened slightly on his stylus. However, Professor Zextera continued, "Human weapons possess one characteristic that makes them worthy of study. They were designed not for specialized users, but for universal application. Observe the grip patterns, the weight distribution, the handling mechanisms." She zoomed in on a sword, highlighting its handle. This weapon could be wielded by an individual with varying hand sizes, different arm lengths, and diverse strength levels. Human weapons were built for adaptability rather than optimization. A Zephyrian student, her blue-tinted skin gleaming under the lecture hall's lights, raised a clawed hand. "Professor, this adaptability seems like a weakness. Surely specialized weapons would be more effective in the hands of trained warriors." "Unlogical assumption, student Velandra," the professor replied. And, indeed, in single combat scenarios, specialized weapons often demonstrated superior performance. However, human military doctrine evolved differently from most species. The display changed again, showing battlefield formations and tactical diagrams. Humans developed mass warfare concepts earlier than most civilizations. Their weapons needed to be manufacturable in large quantities, trainable to new users quickly, and maintainable under field conditions. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its quiet tone. "Professor, if I may add something to the discussion, Professor Zechthara's scales shifted to a warmer hue, indicating interest. Certainly, student Shun, your perspective would be valuable. Marcus stood, and several students turned to get a better look at him. At average human height and build, he appeared unremarkable compared to the diverse array of species in the class. The weapons you're showing represent only one category of human military technology. There's another classification that might be more relevant to today's discussion about hard-to-hold weapons. Please elaborate, the professor encouraged. Human weapons weren't just designed for adaptability, Marcus explained. Many were specifically designed to be difficult for enemies to use effectively, even if they managed to capture them. We called these user-specific or culturally locked weapons. The professor's four hands moved quickly over her controls, but she appeared to be having difficulty locating the weapons Marcus was describing. I must admit, student Shun, that my research database doesn't contain extensive information about these particular human weapons. Perhaps you could provide some examples? Marcus nodded and walked down toward the front of the class. The most obvious example would be the nunchaku. Two sticks connected by a chain or rope. In the hands of a trained user, it's an extremely effective close combat weapon. But if someone unfamiliar with the specific techniques tries to use it, they would likely injure themselves, completed Altarian student, her crystalline features reflecting the hologram's light. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. But that's just one example. Humans developed dozens of weapons that required not just physical training, but cultural understanding and specific motor skills that took years to develop. Professor Zechthara's scales had shifted to a deep purple, indicating intense curiosity. This is fascinating, student Shun. I must confess that human weapons technology has not been extensively studied in our archaeological programs. Most of our databases focus on the more obvious weapons. That's probably because the truly dangerous human weapons don't look like weapons at all, Marcus said quietly. The lecture hall fell completely silent. Even the ambient hum of the environmental systems seemed to fade as every student focused on the humans standing at the front of the class. What do you mean by that? Professor Zechthara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked around the room, taking in the faces of his classmates. Some appeared curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed slightly worried about where this conversation was heading. Professor, have you ever studied human agricultural tools? Cooking implements? Construction equipment? Sports gear? The professor's lower hands fumbled with her controls while her upper hands gestured uncertainly. Those wouldn't be classified as weapons in our database. No, Marcus agreed. They wouldn't. But that's because most species developed specialized tools for specialized purposes. Humans developed multi-purpose tools that could serve as weapons when necessary. A farming sickle becomes a slashing weapon. A cooking knife becomes a throwing blade. A construction hammer becomes a crushing weapon. He paused, letting this information settle among his classmates. But more than that, humans developed fighting techniques that could turn anything into a weapon. A length of rope, a wooden stick, even a piece of cloth in the right hands. A student from the far left side of the hall, a member of a species Marcus didn't recognize, spoke up. But surely other species must have developed similar adaptive techniques. Marcus shook his head. Not to the same extent. Most species developed weapons based on their natural physical advantages. Kethlani use their razor-sharp claws. Velthari rely on their superior strength and four-armed coordination. Zephyrians have their natural speed and agility. Humans had none of those advantages. So you compensated by turning everything into a potential weapon, Professor Zechthara said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. We compensated by learning to fight with our minds instead of our bodies, Marcus corrected. The most dangerous human weapons aren't things you can hold in your hand. They're concepts, strategies, ways of thinking about conflict that don't depend on having the right equipment or the superior physical capabilities. The professor's hands hovered over her controls, but she seemed unsure how to proceed. Student Shun, would you be willing to demonstrate some of these concepts? For educational purposes, of course. Marcus looked around the room again, this time assessing rather than observing. I could show you a few basic principles, Professor, but I should warn you that human combat techniques can appear deceptively simple while being extremely difficult to counter if you're not familiar with them. Please proceed, she encouraged. This is exactly the kind of comparative analysis that makes this course valuable. Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out what appeared to be an ordinary stylus, the same type every student in the class used for note-taking. He held it up for everyone to see. This is a standard university stylus, he announced. 12 centimeters long, made of lightweight composite material, designed for writing and interface interaction. He moved the stylus through his fingers with casual ease, spinning it around his thumb and catching it again. The movement looked like a simple fidget, the kind of absent-minded manipulation many students perform during long lectures. In human hands, this becomes a pressure point weapon capable of causing temporary paralysis, a throwing implement with sufficient range and accuracy to hit targets 15 meters away, or a leverage tool that can multiply force by a factor of 10 when applied correctly. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The harmless stylus suddenly seemed much more significant. But the truly dangerous part, Marcus continued, isn't the tool itself. It's the mindset that sees a writing implement as a weapon. Humans learn to look at every object, every environment, every social situation as containing potential tactical advantages. Professor Zextera had stopped taking notes entirely. Her four hands remained motionless as she stared at Marcus with growing fascination and concern. Student Chun, are you saying that humans approach every interaction as a potential conflict? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. Not exactly, Professor, but humans learn to maintain awareness of the potential for conflict in every situation. We call it situational awareness or tactical thinking. It's not paranoia or aggression. It's simply preparedness. He slipped the stylus back into his bag with the same casual motion he had used to retrieve it. The reason these weapons are hard to hold isn't because they're physically difficult to grasp. It's because they require a completely different way of thinking about the world. They require you to see connections and possibilities that most species never learn to recognize. The lecture hall remained silent for several long moments. Finally, a student near the front raised a tentative appendage. Student Chun, if human weapons are so conceptual, so dependent on mindset rather than tools, then how did other species ever manage to defeat humans in combat? Marcus smiled for the first time since the discussion began. It wasn't a particularly warm expression. Professor, that might be a good topic for next week's lecture. The history of human military conflicts with other species makes for very interesting reading. Professor Zextera's scales had shifted to a pale yellow, indicating uncertainty mixed with excitement. Yes, I think that would be an excellent topic for our next session. Class dismissed for today. Student Chun, would you mind staying behind for a few moments? As the other students filed out of the hall, their conversations hushed but animated, Marcus gathered his materials and approached the professor's desk. Professor Zextera waited until the last student had left before speaking. Student Chun, I must admit that today's discussion has revealed significant gaps in my knowledge of human military history. Would you be willing to assist me in preparing for next week's lecture? Marcus nodded slowly. I'd be happy to help, Professor. But I should warn you that human military history can be disturbing to study. We didn't just develop weapons that were hard to hold. We developed ways of fighting that were hard to understand, hard to predict, and very hard to stop. The professor's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a deep blue that Marcus had learned indicated serious academic interest. Student Chun, I believe this course just became far more interesting than I originally planned. As Marcus left the lecture hall, he could hear Professor Zextera already making calls to the university's research division, requesting access to previously classified human military databases. He had a feeling that next week's class would attract a much larger audience. What his classmates didn't know yet was that human weapons technology hadn't stopped evolving when they joined the galactic community. It had simply become more sophisticated, more subtle, and infinitely more dangerous. The hard-to-hold weapons were just the beginning. The university's main research library hummed with activity as Professor Zextera worked through the night, her four arms moving continuously between different data terminals. The restricted human military archives had finally been unlocked for her research, and what she was discovering challenged everything she thought she knew about human warfare. Marcus had arrived early, finding the professor surrounded by holographic displays showing battle formations, tactical manuals, and weapon schematics that seemed to defy conventional military logic. Her scales shifted between deep purple and pale yellow as she processed the information, a sign of mental strain that Marcus recognized from his xenobiology studies. "Professor, you look like you haven't slept," Marcus observed, setting down 2 containers of coffee. The professor's species could metabolize the stimulant, though they found the taste unusual. "Student Chun, this material is extraordinary," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I've been reading about human conflicts for 8 hours, and I'm beginning to understand what you meant yesterday about weapons that are hard to hold." She gestured to a display showing what appeared to be ordinary farming equipment arranged in precise geometric patterns. This document describes something called guerrilla warfare, where human fighters used agricultural tools and improvised weapons to defeat opponents with superior technology and numbers. Marcus nodded, settling into a chair beside her workstation. "That's probably the Vietnam conflict documentation. Humans have been developing asymmetric warfare techniques for thousands of years, but that particular conflict demonstrated how effective they could be against advanced opponents." "Asymmetric warfare," the professor repeated, manipulating the display to show different sections of the archived materials. "The concept appears throughout human military history, but I'm struggling to understand the underlying principles." "It's simple in concept, complex in application," Marcus explained. "When you can't win through superior force, you change the rules of engagement. You fight when your opponent doesn't expect it, where they can't bring their advantages to bear, using methods they aren't prepared to counter." The professor brought up a new display showing a detailed analysis of what appeared to be a simple wooden staff. According to this analysis, humans developed over 300 distinct fighting techniques using nothing but a stick. 300 ways to use the same basic tool. "The staff is actually one of the more sophisticated examples," Marcus said. "It looks primitive, but mastering staff combat requires years of training. The weapon becomes an extension of the fighter's body. In skilled hands, a simple wooden stick can defeat opponents armed with advanced melee weapons." Professor Zextera highlighted several sections of the document. "But this suggests that the staff techniques were designed to be effective against multiple opponents simultaneously. Most species develop combat forms for single combat situations. Humans rarely fought alone," Marcus replied. "Even our individual combat techniques were designed to work in group situations. A staff fighter could hold a corridor against multiple attackers, or work with other staff fighters to create defensive formations that were nearly impregnable." The professor opened another file, this one containing video footage from historical human conflicts. The images were grainy and primitive by current standards, but they clearly showed human fighters using improvised weapons with devastating effect. "This footage shows humans using their own clothing as weapons," she observed, zooming in on a sequence where a human fighter used a length of cloth to disarm and disable an opponent. "How is that possible?" Marcus watched the footage carefully. "That's a technique called flexible weapons training. Humans learn to weaponize anything that could be wrapped, twisted, or swung. Belts, ropes, chains, even long pieces of fabric became effective combat tools. But surely the effectiveness of such improvised weapons would be limited," the professor argued. "They couldn't possibly match the performance of purpose-built weapons." "That's where you're wrong, Professor," Marcus said quietly. "Human weapons weren't designed for maximum effectiveness. They were designed for maximum adaptability. A purpose-built weapon is only as good as the specific situation it was designed for. An improvised weapon can be adapted to any situation." He stood and moved to an empty space near the workstations. "May I demonstrate something, Professor? Nothing dangerous, just a basic principle." The professor nodded, her scales shifting to an interested blue. Marcus removed his jacket, a simple garment made of standard university-issue synthetic fabric. He held it up for the professor to see, then demonstrated how the sleeves could be knotted to create handles, how the body of the jacket could be twisted into a rope-like configuration, and how the entire garment could be swung to deliver impact at a distance. This jacket becomes a net for entanglement, a whip for striking, a rope for binding, or a shield for deflection. He explained, manipulating the garment through different configurations with practiced ease. And when the fight is over, it goes back to being a jacket. Professor Zextera recorded everything with her multiple hands, but Marcus could see the growing concern in her expression. Student Shun, are you saying that humans see potential weapons everywhere they look? Not exactly, Marcus replied, returning the jacket to its normal configuration and putting it back on. We see potential tools everywhere we look. Whether those tools become weapons depends on the situation. The professor returned to her displays, bringing up a new set of documents that appeared to contain psychological analyses rather than technical specifications. These files suggest that human weapons training involved more than just physical techniques. There are extensive references to mental conditioning and psychological preparation. Marcus sat back down, his expression becoming more serious. Professor, human warfare wasn't just about defeating enemies physically. It was about defeating them mentally. Many of our most effective weapons were psychological rather than physical. I don't understand, the professor admitted. Consider the staff techniques we discussed earlier, Marcus explained. A human staff fighter wasn't just trained to use the weapon effectively. They were trained to use it in a way that would intimidate opponents, create fear, and break enemy morale. The spinning motions, the complex patterns, the apparent ease with which the fighter controlled the weapon, all of these were designed to have psychological impact. The professor brought up video footage of human staff demonstrations, watching with new understanding as the fighters moved through elaborate routines that emphasized grace, control, and intimidating complexity. The weapon becomes a form of psychological warfare, she realized. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. An opponent who believes they're outmatched is already halfway to being defeated. Human weapons were designed to create that belief, even when the physical capabilities were relatively modest. Professor Zextera opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be training manuals for something called empty-hand combat. The documentation showed humans learning to fight without any weapons at all, using only their bodies and minds. This is even more disturbing, she observed. Humans developed ways to turn their own bodies into weapons. These techniques appear to be specifically designed to cause maximum damage with minimal effort. Marcus nodded grimly. Empty-hand combat was considered the foundation of all human weapons training. The theory was that if you could fight effectively without weapons, you could fight effectively with anything you could get your hands on. But the techniques described here, the professor scrolled through detailed descriptions of pressure points, joint locks, and nerve strikes. These aren't just combat techniques. They're medical knowledge applied to warfare. Humans were unique in combining medical and military knowledge, Marcus agreed. We learn anatomy not just to heal, but to harm efficiently. We studied physiology not just to enhance performance, but to target vulnerabilities. The professor stood and walked around the workstation, her forearms gesturing in agitation. Student Shun, I'm beginning to understand why human weapons are considered hard to hold. It's not just the physical techniques. It's the entire mindset required to use them effectively. You're starting to get it, Marcus said. Human weapons required users to think like humans. They required a willingness to see conflict in unconventional terms, to adapt constantly, and to use any available advantage regardless of how others might judge those tactics. Professor Zextera stopped pacing and turned to face Marcus directly. Student Shun, I have to ask, are these techniques still practiced among humans today? Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. Professor, humans didn't stop being human when we joined the galactic community. We just got better at hiding our capabilities. The professor's scales shifted to pale yellow again, indicating uncertainty. What do you mean by that? Modern humans still train in traditional combat techniques, Marcus explained. We call it cultural preservation or historical study. But the knowledge is still there. The skills are still maintained. The mindset is still developed. For what purpose? The professor asked. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Because humans learned a long time ago that the most dangerous time to disarm is when everyone believes you're no longer a threat. The professor returned to her workstation and began closing the various files and displays. Student Chun, I think I need to reconsider the scope of next week's lecture. This material is far more complex than I originally anticipated. Professor, there's something else you should consider, Marcus said as he gathered his materials to leave. What's that? Everything we've discussed today covers only human weapons development up to about 2,000 years ago. We haven't even begun to explore what humans developed after that period. Professor Zextara's hands froze over her controls. There's more. Marcus smiled, that same cold expression from the previous day's lecture. Professor, what we've been studying today represents human warfare in its infancy. The really interesting developments came after humans learned to combine traditional weapons principles with advanced technology. As Marcus left the library, Professor Zextara stood motionless among her displays, beginning to realize that she had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple archaeological study. The hard-to-hold weapons weren't just historical curiosities. They were the foundation of something that was still evolving, still developing, still being refined by a species that had never really stopped preparing for war. She began to understand why human military databases had been classified in the first place. Some knowledge was dangerous not because it was secret, but because it revealed capabilities that were better left unexamined. But now she had opened the files, and there was no way to unknow what she had learned. All she could do was continue deeper into the documentation and hope that her growing understanding wouldn't attract the wrong kind of attention from the university's security protocols. What she didn't know yet was that Marcus had been reporting their conversations to human intelligence services from the very beginning, and that tomorrow's lecture would be attended by observers who weren't enrolled in the class. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity when Marcus arrived for the next class. Word had spread throughout the university about Professor Zextara's discovery of the classified human military archives, and students from multiple disciplines had crowded into the amphitheater. Advanced xenobiology majors sat next to political science students, while several faculty members had taken seats in the observation galleries normally reserved for formal academic presentations. Marcus noticed the additional attendees immediately. 3 individuals in the back rows wore the subtle insignia of the Galactic Council's Intelligence Division, while 2 others displayed the discreet markings of the university's own security department. More concerning were the 4 humans scattered throughout the audience, all wearing civilian clothing, but carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military personnel. Professor Zextara appeared nervous as she activated the lecture hall's privacy shields and security protocols. Her scales flickered between pale yellow and deep purple as she addressed the expanded audience. Today's lecture will focus on advanced human weapons development, she announced, her voice carrying clearly despite a slight tremor. I must warn you that some of this material may be disturbing to species unfamiliar with human military philosophy. She activated her holographic display, showing what appeared to be a simple metal sphere about the size of a human fist. This object was discovered in the ruins of a human military installation dating to approximately 1,500 years ago. Initial analysis suggested it was simply a piece of scrap metal, possibly debris from equipment maintenance. The sphere rotated slowly in the display, revealing intricate markings and small mechanical components embedded in its surface. Further investigation revealed that this scrap metal was actually a sophisticated weapon system capable of multiple deployment modes depending on how it was activated. A student in the front row, one of the Altarians whose crystalline features reflected the hologram's light, raised a delicate appendage. Professor, How can such a simple object function as a weapon system? Professor Zexthera manipulated her controls, and the sphere's display expanded to show internal schematics. The object contains 7 different activation mechanisms. Depending on which mechanism is triggered, it functions as an explosive device, a smoke generator, a flashbang disruptor, a chemical dispersal system, an electromagnetic pulse generator, a tracking beacon, or a simple kinetic projectile. The audience stirred uneasily as the implications became clear. Several students took notes frantically while others sat in stunned silence. But the truly remarkable aspect, the professor continued, isn't the weapon's versatility. It's the activation system. Each function requires a specific sequence of manipulations that would be intuitive to humans, but nearly impossible for other species to discover accidentally. Marcus watched the crowd's reaction carefully. The intelligence agents were recording everything, while the military personnel maintained carefully neutral expressions. His fellow students displayed varying degrees of fascination and concern. Student Chun, Professor Zexthera called. Would you be willing to explain the reasoning behind such complex activation systems? Marcus stood slowly, aware that every eye in the hall was now focused on him. The activation complexity serves multiple purposes, Professor. First, it prevents accidental deployment. Second, it makes the weapons useless to enemies who might capture them. Third, it allows a single tool to serve multiple tactical functions depending on the situation. But surely such complexity would be a disadvantage for the users themselves, argued a Zephyrian student. Wouldn't simpler, more reliable weapons be more effective in combat situations? That assumes humans wanted their weapons to be simple and reliable, Marcus replied. Human military doctrine was based on different principles. We preferred weapons that could adapt to changing circumstances rather than weapons optimized for specific scenarios. Professor Zexthera brought up a new display showing an array of objects that looked like common tools: a hammer, a wrench, a cutting implement, and what appeared to be a standard communication device. These items were recovered from the same military installation, she explained. Each appears to be a standard tool for construction or maintenance work. However, analysis revealed that each one contains hidden weapon capabilities activated by specific manipulation sequences. The hammer's display expanded to show internal components that could transform it into a projectile weapon. The wrench revealed capability as an energy weapon when its handle was adjusted in a particular pattern. The cutting tool contained a vibration system that could turn it into a molecular disruptor. The communication device could function as an area denial weapon when activated through an undocumented command sequence. Human soldiers carried toolkits that were indistinguishable from civilian equipment, Professor Zexthera continued. But every tool could become a weapon when needed. Every piece of equipment served multiple purposes. A faculty member in the observation gallery leaned forward. Professor, this suggests that human military personnel could operate undercover among civilian populations while remaining fully armed. The professor's scales shifted to a worried pale yellow. That appears to be exactly what these systems were designed for. Human military doctrine included extensive provisions for covert operations and irregular warfare. One of the intelligence agents in the back rows spoke for the first time. Professor, are you suggesting that contemporary humans might still possess such capabilities? The hall fell completely silent. Even environmental systems seemed to pause as everyone waited for the answer. Professor Zexthera looked toward Marcus, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the question implied. That would be a question for Student Chun to address. Marcus remained standing, but took his time before responding. Agent Kreltox, isn't it? Galactic Council Intelligence Division. The agent's expression didn't change, but Marcus noted the subtle tension that appeared in his posture. The question you're really asking isn't about historical capabilities. You want to know whether modern humans still think like weapons. That's a very specific way to phrase the question, the agent replied. It's the correct way to phrase it, Marcus said. Human weapons weren't just tools. They were expressions of human psychology. They reflected how humans approach problems, how we adapted to challenges, how we thought about survival and victory. Marcus walked down toward the front of the hall, moving with the same casual confidence he had displayed in the previous lecture. The real question isn't whether humans still possess ancient weapon technologies. The question is whether humans still possess the mindset that created those technologies. He reached the front of the hall and turned to face the audience. Professor Zextera has shown you tools that could serve multiple functions, but she hasn't shown you the most important human weapon development of all. Which is? The professor asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Marcus gestured toward himself. Humans learned to turn themselves into weapons. Not just their bodies, but their minds, their personalities, their social interactions. Their entire approach to existence became a form of weaponry. The military personnel in the audience had gone completely still, while several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Every human skill became a potential weapon. Marcus continued. Our art became psychological warfare. Our literature became propaganda systems. Our philosophy became strategic doctrine. Our science became the foundation for new forms of conflict. Professor Zextera's hands hovered over her controls, but she seemed uncertain how to respond to Marcus's statements. But the most sophisticated human weapon, Marcus said quietly, was our ability to make other species forget that we were still armed. Agent Kreltox stood up in the back row. Student Chun, are you making some kind of threat? Marcus smiled, and several people in the audience visibly flinched. Agent, I'm giving a lecture on human weapons development. If you interpret education as a threat, that says more about your own mindset than mine. The agent remained standing. The Galactic Council has maintained peace for over 800 years. Human military capabilities are monitored and regulated under the species integration protocols. Monitored and regulated, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I'm sure they are. Tell me, Agent, how do you monitor a mindset? How do you regulate a way of thinking? How do you control capabilities that don't depend on technology or equipment? Professor Zextera finally found her voice. Student Chun, perhaps we should return to the historical aspects of the discussion. Of course, Professor, Marcus agreed, but he didn't move from his position at the front of the hall. Let's discuss history. Specifically, let's discuss what happened during the integration wars when other species attempted to conquer human territories. The professor's scales shifted to deep purple as she accessed historical databases. The integration wars were resolved through diplomatic negotiation. Military action was limited and brief. Limited and brief, Marcus nodded. That's the official record. But, Professor, you now have access to the classified archives. What do those records say about human performance during those conflicts? The professor manipulated her controls hesitantly, bringing up files marked with multiple security classifications. The displays showed battle reports, casualty figures, and tactical analyses that painted a very different picture from the sanitized historical accounts. According to these records, she said slowly, human forces achieved victory ratios that were statistically impossible given their apparent technological disadvantages. Impossible, Marcus agreed. Unless you understand that humans weren't fighting with the weapons their enemies expected them to use. The intelligence agent was still standing, and now the military personnel had shifted position to maintain better sight lines throughout the hall. Marcus noticed their movements, but continued speaking calmly. Humans didn't meet their opponents in conventional battles where superior technology would determine the outcome, he explained. Instead, humans turned the conflicts into puzzles that only humans knew how to solve. What kind of puzzles? Asked a student near the middle of the hall. The kind where victory didn't depend on having better weapons, Marcus replied. The kind where victory depended on understanding how to use any available resource as a weapon. The kind where victory depended on thinking like a human. Professor Zextera brought up tactical diagrams from the integration wars, showing battle formations that defied conventional military logic. These strategies appear to involve deliberate vulnerability. Human forces repeatedly position themselves in disadvantageous terrain and inferior tactical positions. Because humans understood something about warfare that other species hadn't learned, Marcus said. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your opponent think they're winning right up until the moment they lose. The agent in the back row was now speaking quietly into a communication device, while the military personnel had begun moving slowly toward the exits. Marcus observed their movements with casual interest. The integration wars ended with diplomatic negotiation, he continued, because humans convinced the other species that continued conflict would be unprofitable, not through threats or demonstrations of force, but through careful application of psychological pressure and strategic misdirection. Student Chun, Professor Zextra said urgently, I think perhaps we should end today's lecture early. Marcus looked around the hall, taking in the nervous faces of his fellow students, the obvious alarm of the intelligence agents, and the tactical positioning of the military personnel. Of course, Professor. I think we've covered enough material for one day. As students began filing out of the hall, many of them casting worried glances back at Marcus, Agent Kreltox approached the front of the room. Student Chun, the Galactic Council would like to speak with you about today's discussion. Marcus gathered his materials with unhurried efficiency. I'm sure they would, Agent. But I have another class to attend. Perhaps we could schedule something for later in the week? This isn't a request, the agent said firmly. Marcus looked up from his bag with an expression of mild curiosity. Agent Kreltox, are you detaining me? Under what authority? For what violation? The agent hesitated, clearly uncertain of his legal position. The council needs to understand the implications of what you've revealed today. I haven't revealed anything that wasn't already in the university's own databases, Marcus replied reasonably. I've simply provided historical context for academic research. As Marcus walked toward the exit, Professor Zextra called after him. Student Chun, will you be attending next week's lecture? Marcus paused at the doorway and smiled back at her. Of course, Professor. We haven't even begun to discuss the really interesting developments yet. As he left the hall, Marcus could hear Agent Kreltox making urgent communications while Professor Zextra began the process of securing and classifying all of the day's materials. What none of them realized was that the real demonstration had already begun, and every move they made from this point forward would only prove Marcus's points about human weapons being difficult to recognize and impossible to defend against once they were deployed. The emergency session of the Galactic Council Security Committee convened in the early hours of the morning, 3 days after Marcus's lecture. Agent Kreltox stood before a semicircle of representatives from 12 major species, his report hologram displaying tactical analyses and threat assessments that had kept the intelligence services busy since the university incident. The situation is more complex than we initially believed, he began, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Our investigation into the human student statements has revealed concerning patterns throughout human-occupied territories. Committee Chair Vexmaron, an elderly Altarian whose crystalline features had dulled with age, gestured for him to continue. Agent Kreltox, your preliminary report suggested that this was an isolated academic discussion. Are you now saying otherwise? Chair Vexmaron, we have discovered that similar academic discussions have been occurring at universities across 17 different systems. Each time, human students enrolled in military history or archaeological courses have gradually introduced materials that reveal previously unknown aspects of human warfare capabilities. The holographic display shifted to show a map of the galaxy with highlighted systems where such incidents had been reported. The pattern was unmistakable. Human populations were systematically educating other species about capabilities that had supposedly been abandoned centuries ago. Representative Tishvis Indra of the Zephyrian delegation leaned forward, her blue-tinted features reflecting concern. Agent, are you suggesting this represents some form of coordinated operation? That's the disturbing part, Agent Kreltox replied. We can find no evidence of coordination. No communication networks, no command structures, no central planning. Yet the timing and content of these revelations suggests a level of organization that we cannot detect or understand. The committee members exchanged worried glances across species lines. The concept of invisible organization was particularly troubling to beings who had evolved hierarchical social structures. "What about the human student at the university?" asked Representative Morthek, his Velthary scales shifting to an agitated orange. "Have you been able to question him about these activities?" Agent Krell-Tox's expression darkened. Marcus Chun disappeared from university grounds the day after his final lecture. University security records show him leaving the campus, but there is no trace of him afterward. His student registration was filed under proper documentation, but deeper investigation reveals that his background information becomes increasingly sparse the further back we search. "You're saying he may not be who he claimed to be?" Chair Vexmiron asked. "I'm saying that Marcus Chan appears to have been constructed as an identity specifically for this operation," the agent replied. "But constructed so skillfully that we didn't detect the deception until we began intensive investigation." The holographic display changed to show detailed biographical information that gradually became more and more questionable as it reached back in time. Birth records that reference hospitals that had been demolished. Educational achievements from institutions that had changed their record-keeping systems. Employment history with companies that had undergone multiple corporate restructurings. The identity was designed to pass casual inspection while becoming increasingly difficult to verify under detailed scrutiny, Agent Krell-Tox explained. "It's a sophisticated technique that requires extensive planning and resources." Representative Kethlani of the Predator Union spoke for the first time, her razor-sharp claws extending slightly as she gestured. "Agent, what was the content of this final lecture that caused the human to disappear?" Agent Krell-Tox hesitated before answering. The topic was supposed to be historical human weapons development. Instead, the human spent the entire session demonstrating how current galactic security protocols could be circumvented using techniques derived from ancient human military doctrine. The committee fell silent as the implications sank in. "He demonstrated security vulnerabilities?" Chair Vexmiron asked quietly. "More than that," the agent replied. "He demonstrated that human thinking itself constitutes a security vulnerability that our systems cannot account for. Every protocol we have developed for maintaining galactic peace assumes that all species approach conflict using similar logical frameworks." The display changed again, showing excerpts from Marcus's final lecture. The committee members watched in growing alarm as the human calmly explained how standard security procedures contained assumptions that could be exploited by beings who thought differently about social interaction, resource allocation, and risk assessment. The human argued that galactic security is based on the premise that all species want the same things and will pursue those goals using similar methods, Agent Krell-Tox continued. But humans apparently developed goal structures and methodologies that don't fit those assumptions. Representative Tichwe Sisindra was studying the lecture transcripts with obvious concern. "Agent, is the human suggesting that his species has been deliberately concealing their true capabilities for centuries?" "That's the most troubling interpretation," he confirmed. The human claimed that the integration wars didn't end because humans were defeated or convinced to join galactic civilization peacefully. He suggested they ended because humans achieved their strategic objectives and no longer needed to continue fighting. "What strategic objectives?" Representative Morthek demanded. Agent Krell-Tox brought up the final section of Marcus's lecture, displaying quotes that had been analyzed by the Council's best xenopsychologists. According to the human, the objective was to position humanity within galactic civilization in such a way that other species would voluntarily limit their own capabilities while humans maintain the ability to operate without restrictions. The committee chamber erupted in alarmed conversation across multiple species communication methods. Chair Vexmiron had to activate the chamber's order maintenance systems to restore quiet. "Agent Krell-Tox, are you saying that humans have been manipulating galactic policy for 8 centuries?" "I'm saying that the human student made claims to that effect," the agent replied carefully. "Whether those claims represent truth, propaganda, or psychological warfare is unclear. But You believe the claims are credible enough to convene an emergency security session, Representative Kethlani observed. The claims are credible enough that we cannot afford to dismiss them, Agent Kreltox confirmed, particularly given what happened during the investigation that followed. What happened during the investigation? Chair Vexmaron asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Every attempt to verify or disprove the human statements led to the discovery of additional concerning information, the agent explained. The more we learned about historical human activities, the more questions arose about current human activities. The display showed a complex flowchart depicting the investigation's progression. Each attempt to resolve questions about human capabilities had led to more sophisticated questions. Each effort to understand human motivations had revealed additional layers of complexity. We discovered that human academic institutions regularly offer courses in historical combat techniques and traditional martial arts. These courses are presented as cultural preservation activities, but the techniques being taught are identical to the military skills described in the classified archives. Are you saying that humans have been maintaining military training under the guise of cultural activities? Representative HFY Scinder asked. I'm saying that the distinction between cultural preservation and military preparation may not exist in human thinking, Agent Kreltox replied. Humans appear to approach every activity as having potential military applications. The committee members were now showing obvious signs of distress across species lines. Scales shifted colors, crystalline features dulled, and various appendages displayed agitation patterns. Agent, what does your analysis suggest about current threat levels? Chair Vexmiron asked. That's the most disturbing aspect of this investigation, he replied. Traditional threat assessment assumes that dangerous capabilities will be visible through intelligence gathering. But if human capabilities are based on psychological frameworks rather than technological systems, then our intelligence gathering methods may be fundamentally inadequate. You're saying we can't detect human weapons because we don't understand how to look for them, Representative Morthek summarized. I'm saying we can't detect human weapons because we don't understand what qualifies as a weapon in human thinking, Agent Kreltox corrected. The university lectures suggest that humans consider everything around them to be potential tactical resources. Chair Vexmaron stood slowly, her ancient crystalline structure reflecting the chamber's lights with unusual patterns. Agent Kreltox, what is your recommendation for responding to this situation? The agent was quiet for several long moments before answering. Chair, I believe we are facing a scenario that our protocols were not designed to address. We have potential evidence of a species-wide capability that has been concealed for centuries, but we cannot verify the extent of the threat without actions that might themselves constitute provocative escalation. You're saying that investigating human capabilities might trigger exactly the kind of conflict we're trying to prevent, Representative Kethlani realized. That's my assessment, he confirmed. If humans have been deliberately maintaining low visibility for strategic reasons, then drawing attention to their capabilities might cause them to abandon that strategy. And if they abandon the strategy of low visibility? Chair Vexmiron asked. Agent Kreltox looked around the committee chamber, taking in the faces of representatives who had spent their careers maintaining galactic peace through careful diplomacy and mutual cooperation. Then we discover what humans are actually capable of when they stop pretending to be like everyone else. The committee chamber fell silent again as each representative contemplated scenarios that their civilizations had never prepared to address. For 8 centuries, galactic peace had been maintained through the assumption that all species shared similar goals and limitations. The possibility that one species had been operating under completely different assumptions challenged the foundation of everything they had built. Chair Vexmaron, Agent Kreltox continued, there is one additional factor you should consider, which is the human student's final statement before he disappeared. He told Professor Zexthera that the next lecture would cover the really interesting developments. He suggested that everything discussed up to that point represented only historical background material. You're saying that what we've learned so far represents basic information rather than advanced capabilities, Representative HFY said quietly. I'm saying that according to the human, we haven't even begun to understand what we're dealing with. As the committee members began the difficult process of formulating a response to an unprecedented situation, none of them realized that their entire discussion had been monitored by observation systems that didn't appear in any security schematics, and that the information was already being analyzed by individuals who understood exactly how galactic leaders would respond to this kind of threat assessment. The human weapons that were truly hard to hold weren't just physical tools or combat techniques. They were strategic frameworks that turned an opponent's own responses into tactical advantages, and the demonstration had been proceeding flawlessly since the moment Marcus Chun had first entered that university lecture hall. 6 months after the Galactic Council's emergency session, Professor Zexteros sat in her private office reviewing the final reports from the human weapons investigation. The university had been transformed by the events that followed Marcus Chin's disappearance, with new security protocols, restricted access to historical archives, and a significant increase in intelligence monitoring of all academic activities. A soft chime indicated someone requesting entry to her office. She looked up to see Marcus Chun standing in her doorway, dressed in the same casual student attire he had worn during his lectures, carrying the same simple bag, displaying the same mild expression that had characterized all of their previous interactions. Professor Zexteros' scales immediately shifted to a pale yellow, indicating extreme alarm, and her 4 hands moved instinctively toward her emergency communication controls. "Please don't," Marcus said quietly, settling into the chair he had occupied during their research sessions. "I'm not here to cause problems, Professor. I'm here to finish the lecture series." "Student Chun," she began, then stopped herself. "Or should I say, whatever your real name is, you've been missing for 6 months. The Galactic Council has issued security alerts. Intelligence services across 12 systems are searching for you." "I know," Marcus replied calmly. "It's been interesting to watch the investigation unfold. Very educational from a strategic perspective." Professor Zexteros kept her hands near her communication controls, but didn't activate them. "Why did you come back? Surely you know this office is monitored now." "Of course it's monitored," Marcus agreed. "That's exactly why I'm here. The monitoring systems represent the perfect venue for the final lesson in human weapons development." "I don't understand," the professor admitted, though her scales had shifted to the deep purple that indicated intense curiosity was competing with her alarm. Marcus opened his bag and removed the same ordinary stylus he had used in his original demonstration. "Professor, over the past 6 months, how much has galactic security changed in response to the human threat assessment?" Professor Zexteros considered the question carefully. "Considerably. New monitoring systems, enhanced investigation protocols, increased intelligence gathering, additional security personnel, restricted access to sensitive materials." "And how much has human behavior changed in response to these new security measures?" She paused, realizing where his question was leading. "There have been no reports of changed human behavior. No unusual activities, no apparent responses to the increased security." "Exactly," Marcus said, beginning to manipulate the stylus through his fingers in the same casual patterns he had demonstrated months earlier. "The Galactic Council implemented extensive changes to defend against a perceived threat, while the supposed threat source showed no reaction to those defensive measures." "You're saying the humans haven't responded because there was no actual threat to respond to?" the professor asked. "I'm saying that the humans haven't responded because the response was already incorporated into the original strategy," Marcus corrected. "Professor, what do you think is the most effective way to test the security capabilities of a galactic civilization?" Professor Zexteros stared at him as understanding began to dawn. "You deliberately triggered an investigation to observe how galactic security would respond to a perceived human threat. Not just to observe," Marcus said, "but to map the complete response framework. To understand decision-making processes, communication protocols, resource allocation methods, and psychological pressure points across all major species." The professor's scales had now shifted to a worried orange. Student Shun, are you saying that everything you revealed about human weapons was false? Not false, Marcus replied. Incomplete. Everything I told you about historical human weapons development was accurate, but it represented only one aspect of human strategic thinking. What aspect? Marcus set the stylus on her desk and leaned back in his chair. The educational aspect. Humans learned that the most effective way to defeat opponents wasn't to hide capabilities from them, but to reveal capabilities in ways that would cause them to defeat themselves. Professor Zextera was now manipulating her controls, bringing up displays showing the investigation reports that had consumed Galactic Intelligence Services for the past 6 months. You're saying the humans wanted the Council to discover information about human weapons. Professor, consider what the investigation accomplished from a human perspective, Marcus suggested. 6 months ago, Galactic Security operated under assumptions about human capabilities and intentions that were 8 centuries old. Now, Galactic Security operates under completely different assumptions that humans helped to create. The professor studied the reports with new understanding. The investigation forced the Council to reveal how they gather intelligence, how they assess threats, how they coordinate responses, and how they make strategic decisions. More importantly, Marcus added, it forced them to reveal the psychological frameworks they use when dealing with perceived threats. Now humans understand how galactic leaders think, how they prioritize concerns, and how they can be influenced to make specific types of decisions. Professor Zextera was quiet for several long moments, processing implications that continued to multiply the more she considered them. Student Shun, if this was all a human intelligence operation, then why are you telling me about it? Marcus smiled, and she realized that this expression no longer seemed cold or threatening. Instead, it appeared almost sad. Because the operation is over, Professor. We've learned what we needed to learn, which was that galactic civilization isn't ready for humans to be completely honest about their capabilities, he said quietly. The investigation revealed that other species respond to perceived human threats through fear, increased restrictions, and attempts at control rather than through communication and cooperation. The professor's scales shifted through several colors as she struggled to process this information. You're saying that humans have been concealing their capabilities to protect other species, to protect the stability of galactic civilization, Marcus corrected. Humans learned centuries ago that their natural approach to problem-solving tends to make other species uncomfortable. So humans developed social strategies designed to maintain peaceful coexistence. By pretending to be weaker than you actually are, by focusing on cooperation rather than competition, Marcus explained. But the investigation showed that even cooperative humans are perceived as threatening when other species understand how humans actually think. Professor Zextera brought up displays showing the current status of human populations throughout galactic civilization. Student Shin, what happens now? The Council knows that humans have been concealing capabilities. They'll want answers, explanations, assurances. They'll get them, Marcus assured her. Human diplomatic services are already preparing comprehensive briefings for the Council leadership. Complete disclosure of historical and current capabilities, full transparency about strategic frameworks, and detailed proposals for modified cooperation protocols. Complete disclosure? The professor asked skeptically. Marcus nodded. Humans have concluded that partial disclosure creates more problems than it solves. If galactic civilization is going to include humans as genuine partners, then our partners need to understand what they're working with. And if galactic civilization decides it doesn't want genuine partnership with humans, Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering. Then, humans will adapt, Professor, just like we've always adapted. But the option for partnership will remain available whenever other species are ready to pursue it. Professor Zextera stored all of her displays and turned her full attention to Marcus. Student Shun, I have to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Are humans dangerous to galactic civilization? Marcus considered the question carefully. Professor, are you dangerous when you're teaching students about military archaeology? Are you a threat when you're researching weapons technology? Are you aggressive when you're studying conflict resolution? Of course not, she replied. Those are academic activities. Humans think like academics, Marcus said. We study everything, including conflict. We research all possibilities, including warfare. We analyze every scenario, including threats to our existence. But thinking about these subjects doesn't make us inherently dangerous any more than your research makes you a weapons dealer. But humans seem to think about these subjects more comprehensively than other species, the professor observed. Because humans evolved in an environment where comprehensive thinking was necessary for survival, Marcus agreed. But surviving in a dangerous environment doesn't make someone dangerous to others unless they choose to be. Professor Zexteros stood and walked to her office windows, looking out at the campus where students from dozens of species continued their academic pursuits despite all the recent security changes. Student Chun, what will happen to university programs like this one? Will humans continue to enroll in courses about military history? Of course, Marcus replied. Humans are genuinely interested in learning about other species' approaches to conflict resolution. Understanding different perspectives helps humans develop better cooperation strategies. But will these classes continue to result in revelations about hidden human capabilities? Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave, just as he had after every previous session. Professor, humans don't have hidden capabilities anymore. After the council receives the disclosure briefings, everything will be documented in public databases. Any student who wants to research human strategic thinking will find comprehensive information available through normal academic channels. As Marcus reached the door, Professor Zextera called after him. Student Chun, one final question. Yes. Will I see you in class next semester? Marcus paused in the doorway, and his expression became genuinely warm for the first time since she had known him. Professor, I'm auditing Introduction to Cooperative Xenobiology next term. I hear it's an excellent course for learning about peaceful interspecies relations. After Marcus left, Professor Zextera remained at her windows watching students move across the campus. She realized that 6 months ago, she would have found the human student's presence reassuring. Now, knowing what she knew about human capabilities and thinking processes, she found his interest in cooperative xenobiology far more encouraging than his expertise in ancient weapons had ever been concerning. The hardest weapons to hold, she understood now, weren't physical tools at all. They were ways of thinking that could turn any situation into an opportunity for learning, adaptation, and ultimately survival. Humans had spent centuries learning to hold those weapons lightly, wielding them with restraint, and sharing the benefits rather than the dangers with their galactic neighbors. The question wasn't whether humans were dangerous. The question was whether the rest of galactic civilization was mature enough to appreciate the difference between capability and intent, between strength and aggression, between being prepared for conflict and seeking it. Professor Zextera began planning her next lecture series. This one focused on the role of educational exchange in maintaining interspecies cooperation. She had a feeling that understanding human weapons was far less important than understanding human wisdom, and that the real lesson from Marcus Chin's demonstrations wasn't about the tools humans had developed to fight their enemies. It was about the strategies humans had developed to avoid having enemies in the first place. As she prepared her materials for the next semester, she reflected that the most powerful weapons humans had ever created weren't designed to destroy opponents, but to transform them into partners. And perhaps that was the most human approach to conflict resolution of all, winning not by defeating others, but by convincing them that everyone could win together. The hard-to-hold weapons were hard to hold not because they were dangerous, but because they required the wisdom to know when not to use them at all.